Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Biollywood Podcast. In this series, we talk about biological threats and the pop culture media that they appear in. I'm JT O'Brien, Research Principal at the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense, and I'm here with the Commission's Executive Director, Dr. Asha M.
Hey.
And we are also joined by the Commission's Policy Principal, Rod Bradley.
Great, thanks for having me back.
Today, we will be discussing the action-packed film Mission Impossible 2, directed by John Woo and released in the year 2000. This film is the second installment in the Mission Impossible series and stars Tom Cruise as Ethan Hunt. The premise of this movie is it follows an IMF agent who is Ethan Hunt, and he is tasked with recovering a deadly virus known as Chimera and its cure, which is known as Bellerophon. The virus has been stolen by a rogue IMF agent, Asha Ambrose, who plans to release it and profit from the sale of the cure. The film explores espionage, betrayal, and the race against time to prevent a global pandemic. If you have not seen this film, we highly recommend you do so before continuing this podcast, as it will contain spoilers for Mission Impossible 2. This is your final warning, and from this point forward, we will discuss spoilers. Okay, so where do you guys want to start? I think I was shocked by how much bio was in this film.
There was a lot of bio in it.
And I think, Rob, you mentioned you thought it was just maybe like a MacGuffin type of thing.
Before we started recording, I was remarking to the others that, in a lot of movies, particularly some that have been made more recently, bio ends up being a component to it, to the plot as a way to drive the action forward. But oftentimes, once you've established the stakes, the bio relevant elements of it are kind of relegated to the back, and it's just a MacGuffin that the good guys are trying to stop the bad guys from getting, and the bad guys want to get it either for money or world domination or kill everybody. Having not seen this movie for almost 20 years, I had just assumed that this was like it. I remembered it for some reason as being very similar, and as I went back to rewatch it, it struck me how much the movie really goes into various elements of the biological threat, medical countermeasures to address it, motivations to develop and or steal and sell these sorts of things. And it was just really pleasantly surprised to find there were a lot of questions that it generated for me, and a lot of examples it gave, perhaps in some cases unrealistic, about questions that we here at the Commission ask a lot amongst ourselves on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I think it also, I was surprised how much attention to detail was paid on things like PPE, lab containment, even though we'll get into that later, but I think there were some ridiculous things that showed up there.
Surprised about the attention to detail, because Tom Cruise is about attention to detail.
Yeah.
And he lets, from what I understand, he does let some stuff go for the sake of the story or whatever, but if it's possible, he wants it to be realistic.
Right.
It's one of the reasons he does his own stunts too.
Yeah. Which I thought were pretty cool in this film as well. Some of the stunts that they did. Do you guys kind of want to get into a little bit about the virus itself? Sure. I mean, the things that stuck out to me, I think, from the first 10 minutes I was watching, they used the word chimera, which is what we would call a virus that had been spliced together, like they said on this one.
Okay, well, kind of see a bit on the nose, to be honest.
Kind of a bit on the nose, yeah. I don't know if chimera is more of an adjective, but it is a proper noun, at least when we're looking at it. I thought it was interesting that they had Russian scientists that were responsible for creating it.
But located in an Australia-based laboratory.
Correct. Yeah, located in an Australia-based laboratory.
It seemed almost like they wanted to put this on neutral territory, so it wasn't made in the U.S. or Russia or any of the other powers that would have active bioweapons programs.
I thought they were trying to make the point that it could happen anywhere.
Well, I think that's what I meant. That you could put it in somewhere that we don't immediately think of when we think of bioweapons development, and Australia of all places. I thought that was interesting too. I think, I'll be honest, the big question I took away from this movie more than anything else that I took notes about is eventually the justification for the development of this virus, this super virus, and its related cure is that, we wanted to create a cure which, at least in the conversations that are had in the movie, is intended to cure all flu viruses, apparently.
Yeah, it's universal flu.
Which sounds like a flu vaccine or a flu antiviral. Universal flu antiviral was, I guess, the takeaway here. And to do that, they had to create the monster.
The monster.
And my first thought was, did you have to create a super flu made of various strains to create a universal flu antiviral? I mean, that'd be like saying in order to create a universal flu vaccine, we need to create a nasty, the worst super flu.
Yeah, but let's argue that point then for a second. We have been wholly unsuccessful in developing
A
universal vaccine or a universal antiviral to date. And today, what have we been doing? You know, there are different approaches. One approach, as you and I had talked about before, Rob, is they're trying to identify like the ancient part of all influenza viruses and thinking like, okay, if you can go after that one little common piece and then do the vaccine for that, well then, you know, you'll get them all. But these approaches haven't worked yet. They have not. So, I mean, honestly, it also sounded to me like somebody learned a little bit about gain of function and why we might do gain of function research.
And why a corporation might just choose to do gain of function research like this?
Well, it was very much, I would call it like a snowball type of thing, right? That we started with, well, you know, just saying we're looking for the vaccine for all influenza viruses doesn't sound very Mission Impossible-esque. So, okay, so let's make it this, and then let's add this, and then let's add this other thing. You know, it's not, so that's what does make it interesting for us, because as you said, Rob, it's like 14 different things happening all at once, and certainly shows the worst case scenario. But it is not beyond reasonable for somebody to say, we should do gain of function to create the absolute worst thing that we can find and then get the cure. Because then if we create the cure for the worst thing, then we'll get all the other stuff below it. That does not, however, take into account what happens with influenza anyway, right? That it combines and separates and does its thing.
And I was going to say, you know, when we talk about gain of function research, and I've spoken about it with JT before, but there is this question of if you engage in gain of function and you take a virus down this sort of path, is there actually a guarantee that's the path that will eventually walk naturally? And if we develop countermeasures for that sort of development, and it goes this way, are we any more prepared than we would have been otherwise? And so to create a super flu virus with some assumptions that perhaps might not actually occur in nature seems like a waste of resources.
But was this really the motivation, the true motivation?
Well, sure. For
a monetary motive.
Or like, you know, maybe
I don't know if the
leadership
pharmaceutical
thought?
company was planning to release it the same way the IMF agent was.
Well, no. I mean, and that there's a big question mark there. Brendan Gleeson's character, McCloy, you know, he admits while he's convinced that he's infected with this disease that they wanted a real-world example of what the virus could do to the human body as a way to pitch this antiviral to the public, to other corporate investors. Again, I mean, look at this guy. Honestly, the video footage of that man dying is criminal evidence. It really is. So I don't know what the intent was there. But, I mean, I will say, taking a step back, understanding that it's cartoonishly villainish portrayal of a biotech company, it does point to this larger question that we and others in the public health community have wrestled with, which is, what do you do with a medical countermeasure that has no other commercial viability, aside from the federal government or aside from a government entity that would be the buyer? And in this case, McCloy decided we need to spook people into thinking this is something that they need.
Right.
I don't know if the marketing strategy really was thought through beyond that. I honestly think that the terrorists, led by Doug Ray Scott as Sean Ambrose, had a better thing, better outright, more, criminal and horrific strategy, which is actually seed the virus out there in the open and then create the demand.
Right.
Much as, to make a comparison, as we saw with COVID-19, there was plenty of demand for Paxlovid and plenty of demand for vaccines for COVID-19 when it was in its full pandemic mode. That's what they were trying to do here too.
You could make an argument based on what you said a minute or so ago, Rob. For example, if you look at the smallpox vaccine and you say, okay, we've eradicated smallpox except for, specific stores, you could say, well, then why and a lot of people do say, well, why do we have any smallpox vaccine? Why is this necessary in life? Why is it in the stockpile? Why this, why that? Well, as you said, viruses mutate in nature and not in nature, either way. And what happened? We had Mpox show up, and suddenly there's demand. Not just demand, a little bit of demand. We had global demand for something that arose naturally.
Absolutely.
So you can, I think, from a corporate perspective, make that argument that something, especially with influenza, that there could be something else that this vaccine or this antiviral or this cure would be good for. But I would say in this movie, they're not focusing on what would have been the noble, humane thing to do.
Yeah.
They go immediately to Ambrose's view.
Yeah.
And this is how we can manipulate the market.
This is how we can make
Yeah, and Mark goes further, goes into the stock market.
Yeah, well, and
Manipulation too.
that's why I was really surprised to see that, the corporate profits that come with uptake of a medical countermeasure following an outbreak or pandemic, and again, not every corporation that engages in that sort of activity is evil, the way that this, biocide is portrayed as cartoonishly villainous, as I said. But you have real world examples of companies like Moderna and Pfizer developing a product that that the market saw a need for at the time that you had this pandemic ripping through the world, and their profits benefited as a result.
Yeah.
And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But it does, again, it raises the question of market demand versus the product that these companies are developing. And again, I go back to the original argument of, if you're trying to create a universal antiviral for flu, there's going to be so much demand for that.
Yeah. Anyway, season every year.
That's what I'm saying. Once you have Bellerophon, and if you can demonstrate that it works against all flu strains, destroy the heck out of Chimera and just start marketing it every flu season.
Yeah, but what do you think that at some point maybe it jumped the rails? That they started out.
Writers' room, you mean? Absolutely.
Well, not even in the writers' room, in the plot. I mean, just that it could have been that someone said, "Hey, this is what we want to do. We want to cure influenza. We're trying to come up with a universal vaccine, and so we're going to do this." And then maybe it just wasn't going to go anywhere, and all they had was the cure to this very specific chimera that they produced.
Yeah.
Now what are you going to do?
Yeah.
If it's not going to treat any other kind of influenza, it's not going to treat anything else in the viral family, then what are you going to do? And now maybe all it takes is one person to go, well, we could generate some demand.
So let's go back into this, the example of Biosite here is this corporation, one of your scientists has gone rogue, injected themselves with a virus, and easily carried medical countermeasure onto an airplane, which again, 2000 pre-TSA.
It's probably realistic.
Well, I guess it could be, but especially was real back in 2000. You no longer have any Bellerophon, which is a little surprising. You still have Chimera. And you obviously are intent on getting the product that you developed back, Bellerophon. But he also wanted a vial of the Chimera when they were doing the exchange at the end. Well, I guess it's the only Chimera that's left at that point because Chimera's been destroyed. So again, what is the end game for this corporation? Let's just say you're right that this Bellerophon doesn't work on anything else. So were they eventually going to reach the conclusion that they too had to release it somehow to drive up demand?
So let me just insert a quick theory.
Okay.
Not about this movie, but about something else. For the 2001 anthrax events, with the letters and stuff going out, there were questions. Why did that happen? How did that happen? And as you both know, there's significant debate still as to whether Bruce Ivins was actually responsible or solely responsible, right?
Right.
So back before that, though, when the CDC, the FBI, and the Association of Public Health Labs we're setting up the laboratory response network for bioterrorism, I don't want to say a professor, a PhD at the CDC said, now he wasn't being serious and he wasn't suggesting that this is what we should do as a policy, but he said, the only way to test whether people can actually use these laboratory protocols and how things are going to go, how we're going to really respond, how prepared we are, the only way to test it is to put it out there somehow. There could be some, now look at this movie.
Yeah.
Somebody could have said, we need to do this.
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible. And I would not be shocked if after, let's say he had gotten the vials back, minus the hostile corporate takeover by Sean Ambrose. Eventually, maybe Biosite might have decided the only way they could profit from it would be to get it out there.
Maybe even just sort of demonstrate value.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. If you believe that Bruce Ivins did it, that's the motive that they, I think, eventually came down to, was him wanting to preserve funding for his anthrax vaccine. That's the theory, or the motive that they assigned to Bruce Ivins.
I didn't know that.
And I think it's interesting because that was an insider threat, and we have the same type of thing happening in this movie with the insider threat with Sean Ambrose.
Well, for the intelligence, taking advantage of an assignment that he was given because Ethan Hunt had the day off.
Yeah,
literally. This all could have been. This would have not been an issue at all if Ethan Hunt didn't go on vacation. Sean, freestyle rock climbing somewhere in the desert.
But I do have to say, there are too many movies out there where the feds are like, they're not making enough money and they decide they have to do something because they're just, they don't have enough in retirement, and it's a little unfair.
Well, for what's worth, they kind of portray Sean Ambrose as a bit of a weirdo and seem a thrill-seeking personality.
Yeah.
But in fairness, of course, I'm not saying which agency the IMF is supposed to be part of, but there are certain agencies in the intelligence community that are known for hiring people that are on the periphery in terms of how they behave and their judgment and stuff. So
No, that's a fair point.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess.
But again, this movie is adding one thing to another thing to another thing to another thing. So this guy he's probably dissatisfied with being in the IMF. He's probably mad at Ethan in some way because he's
had to betray him several times. I think he at one point he says, one of the things that I hated most about having to pretend I was you was all the smiling, I think is what he said.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And he's also burned because his girlfriend just left him 6 months ago. So he's probably still feeling that too.
There's definitely a lot of misogyny for him.
Oh, 1,000%.
And the money, and then the stock market, the power that he must have.
Yeah.
It's 14 things going on with this guy. Not to say that it's bad, because this was a very entertaining movie.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But
John Woo at his best.
at his best,
Well, I think the action scenes at the end got pretty good.
yeah, they did.
Yeah, pretty good. So
Okay.
So something else. I took a whole bunch of notes about the science in this movie, and I was just a couple observations as I was going through. Just to kind of set some parameters here, the kind of what's laid out about this virus is that after 20 hours, you're just a goner. That even if the antiviral is administered, it's too late for you, and that you die at 34 hours. There are a couple things I was interested in about this. One, the bleeding from the nose and the eyes when it's a flu virus. It was a little interesting.
Yeah.
Say more of
Confused it with Ebola.
Yeah, I think they did. That was a little odd. And the flaky kind of white skin, after the 27-hour mark was a bit interesting there.
I don't even know what that would refer to. What disease would that be?
I don't know.
The flaky skin?
I don't know. I feel like they just tried to seem ashy. They kind of seemed ashy. Yeah, they just tried to make it, I think, as scary looking as possible. Because if it is a super flu, you wouldn't have those hemorrhagic symptoms.
Yeah, well, I mean, they say, I mean, the video footage, and I want to talk about that in a second, it portrays the virus infecting blood cells. And I was curious for you guys, is that what flu does?
I don't think it does
No.
directly infect the blood cells. I mean, I guess it can.
But
But usually, like when you like
no,
at least for bacteria, when it gets into the blood, or the bloodstream, it's like sepsis, and then you're.
yeah.
I
think
suppose
it's
viruses
impressive, but
could get
that's
in there.
not
It's not typically of how.
that's
flu.
not how and like most things work.
So it also said it was a DNA virus.
Yeah.
Flu is an RNA virus.
So it almost sounds like it's actually like flu plus. It's like it's super flu
flu
plus
plus.
something else,
Yeah.
a little bit of this, a little bit of that, not actually just super flu. Which is
So
interesting.
I have to say, for our future episodes, we really need to remember to look at the credits and
Yeah,
see if
see
we
if
can
there's-
identify who was the the
Consultant.
advisor or whatever.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, so I had two other
Go ahead,
questions.
have one.
What? Oh yeah, they absolutely had,
Yeah.
had one.
Go ahead.
No, that's fine. I did have, so I had two other questions as I was watching this. One, that video of the virus actually infecting the cells was just a joke. It was so funny to see that.
It was not.
And anything remotely approximating real life.
I actually had to go. Like, I went back, I think, to that several times and rewinded it just to get the progression and actually like look and then see. Okay, they're saying it's DNA. And I'm like, yeah.
As if they had a tiny camera inside this man's body, monitoring at every stage of the infection, and then watched it as like it's like the red blood cell just dusted away like it had been snapped by Thanos.
I thought it was funny too, that as on the bottom, like the watermark property of.
Yeah, like, again, what an incriminating video this is. Like, I'm just gonna. And also, I'm still confused about who had that. How Ethan Ambrose got his hands on it. I guess it must have been in the Russian researcher's bag that he brought this incriminating video with him onto an air.
You just insert it into the package with a Chimera and Bellerophon. Anytime you get it, you get a little.
You get a
video.
little incriminating video of the corporation that created this deadly bioweapon. The one thing that stuck out to me the most, though, is that they make it pretty clear that if you do not get this antiviral in your system in 20 hours, you're dead. What virus are we aware of that has a 100% fatality rate after a very specific period of time if an antiviral isn't administered?
Well, it sounded to me like somebody was aware of the use of antivirals or vaccines with smallpox. That you can use smallpox vaccine while somebody is infected, and it'll work. But I do believe it's only for a certain short. No, it's not that short, but it's a short period of time, and then after that, it just like that's it. There's no point in doing the vaccine, or giving somebody who's been infected with the vaccine.
Yeah.
So it could just be like, again, somebody read it over here and thought, okay, we're going to apply that to this.
But even Ebola isn't 100%
No.
fatal,
No, but
especially with medical treatment. I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah. Modern medical treatment.
we do have to accept that this is a Mission Impossible movie, and so we're trying to drive up the tension. You don't know.
But to bring it back to just like an example that's not as severe, obviously, with COVID, you need to take Paxlovid for it to be effective. I'm not saying everyone's 100% going to die from COVID if they don't get Paxlovid, but in order for it to be effective, the sooner you do it, the better.
Yeah.
So absolutely, this is kind of just like a extreme ramp.
Yeah, but in the case of
that
Paxlovid, aren't we really talking about viral load? Right. So if you get in there early with the antiviral, then it's obviously it's doing something and preventing the vaccine of the virus. I'm sorry, from
Impacting.
replicating.
proliferating, replicating. In this case, there's their terminology is kind of all over the place too. It's a cure.
Yeah, it's an antivirus.
It's an antivirus, the antiviral.
As if it's coming in to fight it head on.
And to add further murkiness, at the very end, Anthony Hopkins' character says that they checked her blood and there's not even antibodies in her blood for Chimera, which is just...
That doesn't make any sense. No.
Well, maybe she cleared
The antibodies and the virus?
Well, maybe she never generated antibodies in the first place. Is that possible with an immune system?
I don't think so. I don't think that's
Especially if it's been in her system for 20 hours and right after that 20-hour mark, you start to exhibit symptoms.
like because the antiviral or the cure or whatever should have created antibodies. Otherwise, she would have had there's no way that antibodies would have been produced unless for some reason this virus completely evaded her immune system, and then
But then,
but then the antiviral should have incited those antibodies
to fight.
regardless,
Yeah.
So post treatment with an antiviral, you should absolutely have antibodies, and yet nothing, no evidence of the virus or any antibodies in her system. So again, just to add to the wonderful Hollywood interpretation of.
but again, why? Why would someone add that? I can understand with the other thing, right? You can understand within 20 hours and 30, and why oddly specific?
20 to 37, 31, and then 34. Very
Yeah.
But why that? Somebody said it would be better. Somebody wrote it that way, or the director added to it.
Think about how quickly you'd have to treat people. This was super contagious, and you only had 20 hours
Yeah, and before they're symptomatic.
before they're symptomatic.
Yeah.
This is a doomsday. It is a doomsday type weapon.
I'm saying with the other thing though, there's no evidence. There's no evidence of the virus and
antibodies.
why would somebody say that's what we should say? That's what the line should be.
I know, in the context of that scene, it almost seemed to suggest that the writer or the consultant or whoever was involved in this wanted to convey to the audience that it had been eradicated so thoroughly from her bloodstream there was no way to get any pieces of genetic information from her to recreate the virus.
Understood.
Right? And because the whole point was IMF wanted a sample.
And that Ethan was trying to protect her.
Exactly, and so he just administered the vaccine, didn't take any of her blood before he did that, or the vaccine, the antiviral, didn't take any of her blood, and that when they eventually checked her blood, it was so clean, it was like it had never been in there in the first place. So from a storytelling perspective,
Well, it would have been better to say it that way though.
Right.
It's so clean, it's as if it was never there in the first place. Because you could say, well, maybe they missed something or they're not really seeing what the whole immune response was. But the way they said it was
no
100% no virus and 100%
no antibody, which is just scientifically impossible.
And especially when they explicitly say it infects the blood. Yeah. They specifically say that it infects the blood. But yet it's nowhere to be found in the blood, no trace of it.
Well, what could you now this has nothing to do with the movie, but could you replace a person's blood? You can tidally.
Transfusion.
If you did the a 100% replacement, wouldn't antibodies still show up? Because you're still generating that response, right?
Yeah, it's not just your blood cells that are generating antibodies; it's other parts of your immune system.
Yeah,
They still either.
Wouldn't there be literature on how on people losing immunity to certain viruses following a blood transplant or transfusion?
I think that there is.
There is. Well,
Yeah. But that doesn't necessarily mean there's nothing there. It's just, maybe
It's just a little different,
or
or
it's not as high, or and why are you doing the transfusion in the first a 100% transfusion like that is usually for people who have cancer or something, right? So
already immunosuppressed.
yeah,
But
but it's immunosuppressed as opposed to nothing,
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So it's just an immunosuppression thing. I also thought it was interesting with what happened with the CEO. So did he? Correct me if I'm wrong. He faked an infection on himself.
No, Ethan Hunt made him think he had it.
Made him think he had it.
Yeah.
But he didn't actually have it.
No, they abducted him. They put him in a
Exotic gas.
Yeah, they put him in a fake hospital room, made him think that he had been infected, but in order to extract information. And then once they got what they needed, they knock him back out, put him back in his car, make him think it was all a bad dream.
Yeah.
Very interesting spycraft.
Yes.
Yeah. Definitely.
Well, I mean, we're living in a universe where
Well, it's Mission
there-
Impossible.
human realistic masks are a thing, as well as voice-changing strips on
Oh my
throat.
gosh, I thought that was
2000. I mean, that's that's a pretty impressive technology. We don't even have that really right now.
But you don't know that.
Well, okay. It is not a commercially available technology. Let's put it that way.
But there was a little just microchip strip that you could put over somehow is transducing through your skin
Yep.
Yeah.
to make your voice sound different. I don't know.
I guess
I love
crazy
these old 2000s, how they thought technology was going to be. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they definitely went into this thinking that in 20 years, technology might look like this, even with like the face mask.
I don't know. I don't know that they did that. I think for these movies, it's more about like, what can we do to make it a high energy, high tension, high action movie? What do we need? If this is the base idea, then what do we need to do to expand upon it and make it so that it checks those 3 boxes?
Yeah.
I don't know that there's a view to the future. Oh,
Maybe-
but you're right. I guess maybe, somebody had to write it, which means somebody had to imagine it. And they must have thought there was a chance that it would be realistic
Yeah.
and that it would happen someday.
Or that it wouldn't be too far off from realism, that it could be believable.
Yeah.
Well, and I would say, considering how well the movie did, lots of people thought it was believable.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But I don't know if people going to see a movie equates to, I think everything in this is believable.
Yeah, but I would say at least it equates to, oh my gosh, this is so unrealistic that it could never happen this way.
I do have to ask you about not related to Biodefense, but the combat scenes or the fighting scenes. What did you,
I thought they were fine.
you thought they were fine?
What did you think?
I thought they were a little unbelievable, but they were funny.
Well, but that's
I mean,
typical, right? Of
Yeah.
this, of
And then the
franchise.
gunshots sounded like they came out of Star Wars.
Yeah, well, I don't know.
I mean, the direction style was very interesting. It almost reminded me a little bit of 28 Days Later in the sense that there were definitely a few scenes, including the climactic fight at the end between Ethan Hunt and Sean Ambrose, where Sean tries to shoot him from behind as he's walking to his helicopter.
He does 360 with his
Kicks-
arms flung out.
He kicks the gun up, and he swings it around, and he fires a shot. You don't actually you see him fire the gun, and you see what appears to be some sort of open wound on Sean as he's kicked back. You don't actually see the moment where he gets hit. So again, it's one of those things of you see the before, you see the after, you don't see the moment.
Right.
That happened a couple times that I could tell as I was watching this, and it's fine. It's a fine editorial technique, but I mean, I don't walk into any sort of Tom Cruise movie thinking I'm in for some action realism.
No, yeah, you don't think you're already like a John Wick level.
No.
Well, maybe Top Gun.
Well, sure, dogfighting, yeah. It's dogfighting, but I meant like person on person. There were definitely some times where he was just kind of
He
like,
kicked somebody and they flew in like the other direction.
yeah, so he kicks it in the other direction. There's like he had 2 guns, and he kind of like leaned his the upper half of his body out from behind cover to fire, and I'm like, he would have been dead 15 times doing that. These guys have stormtrooper levels of inaccuracy.
But you have to admit, I thought,
It was definitely
pretty
highly
impressive.
entertaining.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was a good movie. I remember thinking it back then. It still holds up. No complaints there. Speaking of realism, though, and I think you might have alluded to this earlier, JT. I am curious about your thoughts with regard to the laboratory setup on Biosite.
First thing I will say, having a high containment laboratory on a 42nd floor of a skyscraper is probably one of the dumbest things you could possibly do.
Well, you don't know that the entire skyscraper isn't BSL-4.
I think it's not. If I had to guess. Just kidding. Just an educated. So you know how expensive that building would be?
BSL-4?
It didn't look PSL4. I mean, the culture was just sitting out there in the open.
Well, what I'm saying is there are some viruses that people
We'll work on it.
will work on in BSL-2, yeah. Like
Even having a 2 that high
COVID,
up.
right? In
Yeah.
some countries.
Yeah.
Well, by the time they were working on it, wasn't it so prevalent that it wouldn't have mattered
Well, for which?
for COVID?
No, for COVID. So for COVID, when the BSL designation was made, it was before COVID. It was for SARS and it was for MERS.
Yeah.
But it didn't have to do with prevalence. Prevalence has to do with the security about it. Like if it's everywhere, then why are we pretending like, oh my gosh, we have to secure it as if it's a level A agent? Like it's ridiculous. But when COVID occurred, one of the big accusations towards China was
that they were working
you're working on it in a BSL-2. Well, but everybody was working on it in a BSL-2. It's just that suddenly it became more virulent than what we saw with SARS and even with MERS.
What are you talking about when they were working on it before before there was an outbreak,
Right.
before the pandemic began. I thought you meant
Immunization is true. Okay, because China was.
Yeah, and I don't know
know.
that we know that.
Yeah,
All right.
I still don't think we know that. But if that.
But
was
my
the
point,
case-
but my
yeah,
point
still
is
seems-
that somebody could have decided, but it doesn't make sense with the super ultra deadly,
Yeah.
determination of Chimera.
I mean, if you not only did you set out to create the worst flu virus possible, you also, used one of your own researchers as a guinea pig. By the way, am I the only one that thinks that it was a waste of just corporate resources and talent to kill one of the lead researchers on this as a test? I mean, I'm not saying I would have supported killing anyone for corporate benefit or gain, but you're better off finding, like a vagabond on the street, right?
But did they intend to kill him? They had Bellerophon. Weren't they going to infect him and then?
Well, so that was that. You're right. That was McCloy's statement was, I didn't know that you had to administer it after 20 hours, and it's yeah, but still.
They just figured that out.
But if you don't know the answer, if you don't know the answer to that question, why are you infecting one of the two main researchers?
It's not like they're being reasonable about all of this. Come on.
Yeah,
Come on.
the movie
It
has
makes
to
sense
happen.
to them.
Yeah.
The movie has to happen, so they have to, I guess, make those concessions in some way.
Yeah. So looking at that laboratory scene, there were two things that stood out to me. One,
Tom Cruise's PPE was hilarious. Also,
yeah.
he looked like one of the SpaceX suits that they wore,
Yeah.
but way too sleek for the time. Way too sleek for the time.
So they talk about an incubation room where the growth vials are kept, and then an inoculation room with injection guns. And I was just curious, what is the accuracy of those things and statements?
I don't understand why the actual virus itself would be in what you would call an inoculation room, because that's the opposite, kind of what you want out of the virus. So that's where they had those guns, right? It was in that inoculation chamber. So it's you're not inoculating people with this. Those are to infect them purposely with the virus, not inoculate.
You could imagine a case where you're growing stuff on cultures. And then you have a room where you're harvesting stuff, and maybe you have another room where you're weaponizing it or doing something with it to get it to the point where you could, whether inoculation's the wrong word, but you're trying to get it to the point you can inject it.
Yeah,
You can't
isolation
just-
would be the correct.
Trying to isolate
the virus.
You can't just scrape it off of the culture and stick it into a needle. And I mean, I guess you could, but that's not what they're aiming for, right? You're trying to get rid of the junk in the culture. You're trying to gather up enough of the virus to even infect a person. So that would make sense to me, but they didn't do that. It's just there's one room over here, then there's this other room over here.
Yeah.
Who knows what happens in between?
And Tom Cruise definitely took his sweet time with those 3 guns.
Yeah. Definitely took a while to do that. Is that a way that you can dispose of a virus
no
in a
idea what
cabin?
they were doing. I have no idea what that other thing was that attached to the gun. Supposedly blew it out. I have no idea what that was.
And he appeared to almost fire a laser into these specimens.
That was funny, actually, to write a note about that, because that was supposedly a scanning electron microscope, which does not have a laser that comes out and will burn your sample. That's not how they work.
Well, and obviously we've looked at inactivating samples of anthrax and other biological pathogens over the years, and I know that there's always that question of, have you properly inactivated something? So to have a computer helpfully say Chimera
pH level is gone. The temperature is out of range.
and just say Chimera specimen terminated, I was like, wow, this would have been really helpful for us to have had.
I did think that little computer system that was talking back was just hilarious.
This was in 2000.
Yeah,
2000. Man, it'd be great if we had that in 2025.
Right?
Well, I mean, look, one thing to say is it is interesting to see what somebody came up with and what they thought we might have, or maybe not by now, but sometime in the future.
Yeah.
Some of this stuff actually fits with our Apollo program vision.
Yeah.
For biodefense.
Because you want something broad spectrum.
Broad spectrum or super advanced. It's about leading edge research and development, science and technology.
But you don't need to create a super flu to accomplish the
No.
biodefense.
At least not according to us. You don't. But we talk about
But there are people
PPE.
who probably do think that, though. That's like the unilateralist curse, where there's one person who thinks the right thing to do is to make this in order to make the cure.
Yeah.
And they could have the best intentions, being evil. But
I think there are varied opinions about addressing various, addressing different elements of medical countermeasure development, testing, approval. The things that we don't talk about too much, but come up in the midst of a crisis, like challenge studies that we wouldn't even remotely consider in peacetime. So, I mean, there's things that, again, if it were under different circumstances, I would understand. But given the, again, I keep coming back to the term cartoonishly villainous approach of this company to what it was doing, it's kind of tough to take them seriously.
Yeah, and I feel like the researcher, he was a little meta with his description, like, oh, every hero needs a villain. So like they were like just like directly commenting on the absurdity of the cartoonish villain.
You could kind of tell that there was a concerted effort by the folks who were making this movie to try to dumb things down enough for an audience that they assumed wouldn't have our level of understanding on these issues.
Yeah.
And I do appreciate that they felt the need to do that, because they were kind of diving into the subject a bit more than other movies do.
Yeah.
And they were but they were also trying to make it relatable to the audience. And I appreciate that. But the result is you kind of make some of these decisions seem silly and or one-dimensional, in nature.
Yeah. I do wish that they had shown a little bit more about the actual intelligence side of this. How did they find out about this? What were they tracking? How did they, was there a tail to this, or did they just suddenly find out, there's a terrorist thing going on? Biological intelligence is a weakness, and especially back then.
Yeah.
So I was just curious. I don't have more of a comment than that. It would have been nice.
I think it would have been a lot nicer to see, I think, that the more, especially this being an intelligence-focused movie, to see a little bit more of that.
But in any of these movies, do they really ever talk about the analysts?
Not really. I think in recent years, there's been a few movies or shows that have come out that have focused more on the analyst role. Like, I think The Recruit might be one. There might be another one that came out recently, but where they actually do focus on the intelligence gathering.
Well, I think we need to, let's, before Tom stops doing these, we should contact him and say we need a...
He's going to be doing it till he's 90.
You think? Yes?
I mean, I suppose, I don't know, the next one might be the last one.
They're coming out with another one, aren't they?
Yeah, the next one, they're very strange.
Although they said that about Harrison Ford, too, in Indiana Jones, and apparently they're going to do another one of those.
Is it really?
That's what I heard.
Wow. Well, maybe it'll involve a biological threat.
Hopefully, yeah. Before we get to the ratings, there is one other thing I wanted to comment on, which was Nia infecting herself. That would not have saved her life, I think, in that situation. They could have easily just had shot her and taken the blood immediately after.
Yeah,
actually, maybe not immediately after, because it would need some time to incubate, but
yeah, they would have
still be incubating in a dead body. The virus wouldn't just be like, oh, the blood isn't working anymore.
I mean, what I will say is that, they probably would have had to wait at least X amount of time.
Yeah, X amount of time.
Not right in the moment. But from Ethan's perspective, you save the world on what appears to be a yearly basis.
Yeah.
Or at least you stop terrorist attacks, you stop, ne'er-do-wells pretty frequently at this level. This woman who you do have feelings for just injected herself with a virus. And if you were to theoretically leave her alone, you have 20 hours to save her life. But in the real world, anyone in Ethan's shoes knows that as soon as that virus is incubated just enough, the bad guy who plans to sell this for millions of dollars to, checks notes, pharmaceutical companies or terrorists, if Biosite doesn't, allow them to take over the company, can just withdraw as many samples as he wants out of her blood and have that to either sell or engage in attacks to profit off of Bellerophon themselves. It's not like the virus just stays in her body, for the next 20 hours.
It's going to keep replicating.
They can pull samples. They can
get way more Chimera out of her than they could with that little injection.
So this is all just to say that if you're Ethan Hunt, most people, there's an ethical question there. He decided that he could afford to let her live in that moment, despite her telling him to kill her. and that he could return, somehow get a hold of Bellerophon and get it to her in time. And he lucked out that they only pulled the one sample and happened to have it at the meeting that he showed up at. But there's a real question of, would anyone not kill her in that moment? To save, if it means potentially saving the world from a virulent, threat like that.
They didn't go that way with this.
They did not.
This plot.
They did not.
But if I had to imagine in the intelligence community, if there was somebody that existed that would be the equivalent of Tom Cruise in this movie, that would be the call.
But it does raise questions about ethics when addressing biological threats. We've never really been in a position that we know of with public information to have that sort of decision point. But if you know that all that stands between you and a potential pandemic that could kill millions of people theoretically, if the fatality rate on this is what it is just taking one life. I mean, what is that?
It's a trolley problem.
It's trolley problem. Set to the highest difficulty settings and consequence settings, and that's. I don't think Ethan in the moment realized that that's what he was deciding.
I don't think he did either.
Because he's not as clearly well versed in the biological threat as we are. But I think that it's...
I must say, though, this is not the first time that we've seen this sort of plot line. Mm-hmm. When we reviewed one of the Star Trek movies, remember?
Yeah.
The whole thing about Spock and Kirk and the good of the many over the good of the few or the good of the one, and then, Spock's running around all over the place trying to save this one guy, so it was annoying. They should have ejected him, right? Because he was just so full of radiation and dead. So, we believe that we wouldn't do something. We wouldn't go down that path.
Yeah. We want to believe it.
Right.
But if you're faced in that moment, who knows what you might ultimately do.
No, I hear you. But, what the movie makers were faced with was how would the audience fall?
Of course. And it's easy to find. He'll always find another way. The good guy in his movies always finds another way, right? That's what makes them the good guy.
And when he's got 20 hours, he's got this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's a long time for him.
Tom Cruise has solved national crises on much shorter time.
Look, I suppose in his head, of course, we don't know how fast the virus is replicating.
Right.
We don't know how long the incubation period really is, and we don't know at what point the person becomes contagious or infectious or whatever. But, he might have thought, there's time to go, and if it doesn't work out, I can still come back and kill her.
Well, he flat out tells the other characters, the rest of his team, that she'll kill herself if the 20 hours mark comes down.
And there was a scene where she was overlooking
a cliff with the intent of jumping off in an isolated area. That is obviously something to think about, but the fact remains that the bad guys have already extracted the virus from her blood by that point. And therefore, that noble sacrifice has less meaning when they're over here deal-making with, either pharmaceutical companies or people who intend to release the virus, and then, might very well go on to release the virus anyway to boost corporate profits.
Yeah. So. Okay, cool. You guys want to get to the ratings?
Sure.
All right, let's do it. So the first category is the relevance to commission recommendations.
I gave it a 5.
Yeah, I would say. I think it touched on PPE. We're considering a 42-story building, technically IAQ, because I don't think the other tenants are really excited.
Laboratory biosafety,
and biosecurity. So
biological intelligence, intellectual property, medical countermeasures.
Yeah, I would say
preparedness.
I think a 5.
I think a 5 makes a lot of sense for this.
Scientific accuracy would be the next one. They tried, but
I'm a 2.
Yeah, I think a 2 is probably where I'm at.
2.
Yeah, the antiviral thing and the bleeding from from just a virus, you just can't.
They missed
It was confused.
Yeah, it was a little bit all over the place.
Well, there were chimeras all over.
Yeah. I give him a little bit of credit for using that word, but calling it chimera.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I still think it's a 2.
I agree. It's a 2. So then scenario development would be the next category.
I actually,
I think it was pretty interesting.
It exceeded expectations in my mind. As I said, it touched on a lot more topics than I was expecting it to, and it really was food for thought for the movie-going audience who might not think about these sorts of things as much, especially from the corporate perspective.
Yeah.
In a way that, while again was not very kind to corporate, to pharmaceutical companies, was at least slightly more nuanced than what you would get from, say, Resident Evil or some other sort of movie where it's just they're outright evil. And there's just no question about it. And usually it's intended for nefarious purposes. So I kind of appreciated that they really went into this more than I was expecting. So I would give it a 3.5 or even a 4.
I was thinking 4.
Yeah.
Yeah.
4.
And I thought it was they touched on the insider threat, the intel. So I think they did a lot in terms of the scenario development. Next category is entertainment value.
I'd give it a 5.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd say it was very entertaining.
Yeah. Classic. Just
Held up.
Especially for a movie that we'd already seen and that none of us thought it was going to be that big a deal, and then suddenly, we were sucked right back into it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. Next category would be success of the imagination or creativity.
Well, they were very creative.
They were
and imaginative.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily. It doesn't have to
standard.
align with accuracy.
Right.
What do you think was the most creative piece of this story?
I think the most creative aspect of it was kind of tying it to the corporate
Yeah.
stuff.
I was going to say the same.
Tying it to the corporate stuff, having that insider threat, the 20 hours to death really kind of makes it a severe.
And multiple insider threats.
Multiple
right?
insider
So we
threats,
have it in the IMF too.
So I thought it was really good. I'd be inclined to give it a 4, probably. But what do you guys think?
You don't think it was that imaginative or
I think
creative?
For the time.
For the time, it
pre-anthrax.
maybe it was.
Pre-anthrax, that's true.
It was pre-anthrax, and I think that I do think it, as I've mentioned before, it's definitely more nuanced with the corporate piece than other movies have been. But we have seen corporations engaging in bioweapons development. We have seen insider threats. So I guess for me, I'm struggling to think that creatively it is certainly different than other movies in terms of how it brought pieces together. But the individual pieces have been done elsewhere before.
Right.
And that's, I think, where I'm struggling to think where I should grade this. I can't. I'm going between a 3.5 and a 4 on this one.
Okay.
So, but if Asha, if you feel it's a 4, I could settle for that.
I don't know. What do you think, JT?
I'm fine with it. I could see a 3.5 given that arc. That
No,
but-
I think from a bio perspective,
bringing them all
there is a lot of stuff in there that we just don't see in others that I thought was pretty imaginative, even if they did borrow it from.
They were wrong.
The whole combining all that stuff
Yeah.
was
Original in and of itself.
We could do 4.
All right, we'll do a 4. Then the next category would be shock or surprise value. I felt like I wasn't really shocked or surprised by anything other than the amount of detail about this brat. Like nothing surprised me. Like I knew she was going to infect herself at some point once. Like I felt like that wasn't very surprising. I felt like that was.
Well, what he does isn't surprising. It's
just have
the equation.
Yeah.
The Mission Impossible 2 equation.
Exactly. Not to suggest that Mission Impossible movies are formulaic, but you kind of understand when presented with a certain scenario what Ethan Hunt is going to do.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was surprising. I think if anything on this rewatch, what was most surprising was seeing the portrayal of the bio pieces in here.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised at just how funny they were. It's like, especially that video. I just can't get over
The video is hilarious.
I don't know. Give it a 3 then. 2, 1.
I would say.
I would say 2 or 3.
Yeah, maybe 2.5 or 3.
We'll give it 2.5.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Government policy is a nice one. I think this might be another 1.
I don't know.
Really? Why?
What policy
We had an insider threat.
That's not the government's. The government's
their
policy is not insider threat.
They should be considered worried about insider threats.
Well, they should be. They obviously they were.
I mean, they did quickly identify that something
Say
had gone
Falcon.
awry with
Yeah,
the
they did.
operation.
Yeah.
But
And then there's also the government oversight of the pharmaceutical company for the research that they're doing. That was non-existent.
yeah,
Wait, but was it our company? I mean, it's an Australian.
it's an Australia. So Australia, it's about the
We're
Australian
not sure
government.
what the Australian government was. I mean, I don't know. We're supposed to think they didn't have much oversight. You're right. You're right, JT.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, the question really is, I didn't see much government at all here for most of it.
Yeah.
You know, it was Anthony Hopkins at the beginning, at the end, like you said, Asha, and in between, it was just kind of Ethan with two people, because he was only allowed 2 members of his team besides Nyan.
Yeah.
I feel like they would have given a little bit more support if it were super weapon. But you don't really see government for the most part in this movie, and maybe it's the lack of government intervention in Australia and in the United States that is most telling. But you don't see them. You don't hear about it.
And to build on that, if we discovered something was going on in Australia, while you might go ahead and deploy these people, I would hope, as an ally,
We might let them know.
we would let the Australians know.
One of our
what-
guys went rogue in your country.
I don't know that we would say that somebody went rogue, but at least we might say,
Yeah.
hey, we have some evidence of a really creepy laboratory out, in the outback over there. I think you should look into it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. When they were in Australia to go to Biosite, the fact that they didn't interact with any counterparties over there at all, or get any support from them as they attempted to, secure
Impossible their way into the
threat, is a little surprising. It's almost like they knew the Australian authorities would have an issue with that. Which, again, it would be nice if they had addressed it in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. Although that actually might speak to the reality of the lack of joint operations and trying to be covert. But I still think they should have. They should. I mean, the actual policy here is that they didn't. So
That they did.
that's not good policy.
Yeah. I'll go above a 1 just because they did recognize the insider threat pretty quickly.
Okay. What do you think, a 1.5 or a 2?
See, I think
But they should have said-
seen worse
Yeah, we have.
government policy.
So for reference, in Last of Us, in 28 Days, we gave it 1.
Yeah, but we.
In Dune, we gave it 2.
Okay. I don't know. I'm inclined to give it a 3. That's me.
What do you think, Rob?
It's probably a little bit higher than I would have immediately gone with, but
The reason I'm saying it is because the government itself is taking action.
Yeah, through Tom Cruise.
Yeah.
yeah. I guess if you're looking at him as the avatar of the United States government, then sure. I guess we'll give it a 3.
You don't have to. That's just what I'm saying.
I'll say a 2.5.
Since it's there's so much uncertainty, I just can't really gauge the policy is the real issue.
Okay, we'll say 2.5.
Okay.
All right. Portrayal by the actors is the next. I think they all did reasonably well for what they were doing.
Yeah.
Tom Cruise was Tom Cruise.
Well, we often talk about actors and their ability to portray when it comes to the science.
Yeah.
And while the science that Tom Cruise was given to talk about wasn't accurate, I thought he did a good job with what they told him he was supposed to say and supposed to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the portrayal, all in all, was pretty good.
Yeah.
I think Doug Ray Scott, acted a bit over the top, but I think that was the direction he was in as the character.
I mean, this is a John Woo movie, right? As you said.
It's I think that was the intention. It was intentional on the part of the director and the production. So I think everyone else acted pretty well.
Yeah. Also, the line is every hero needs a villain.
Something like that.
I believe so.
Yeah, so villainy
Yeah.
is probably over the top, right?
A little bit of it. But. So what do you guys think for a score?
4?
4. Yeah, 4. 4 sounds good. And the next category is direction. I think John Woo did what John Woo does.
Yeah.
Probably could have used a few fewer birds, but aside from that, I don't know.
Yeah. Few fewer birds. Yeah. I did notice the birds.
That's a John Woo thing.
Yeah.
We just.
So what do you guys think? 4 or 5?
I would give it a 4.5.
Yeah, 4.5. Yeah, okay. But then we have production. I think it was
Fine.
good. For production in those movies. I've been Mission Impossible, Tom Cruise movie. I always feel like is really top notch.
Well, especially for, you know, the time that it was made in.
Especially, yeah.
I mean, you could definitely tell the absence of smartphones. You could definitely feel that it was a bit earlier technology, especially with the cameras that they were using to watch the video on these little cards that nobody uses.
And then car phones.
And they had car phones.
Yeah.
You could feel some of that, but for the time that it was made in,
well done.
it was well done, and it still aged pretty well.
I agree. I think it did. So I would say a 4.5 or 5 for the time.
I think ordinarily we might call it a 4, but because it's a Mission Impossible movie, you can see the money all over it,
dumped
right?
into it, yeah.
You know, and I think that's important.
Yeah, I think
A
so
lot of
too.
these movies, you just didn't get a lot of support on the production side, and the production can only do so much, and we take points off for that. So
Yeah.
I say 4.5.
4.5.
I don't know that I could give it a
think so.
like a
Not a 5.
yeah.
Perfect 5, but I think 4.5 makes sense. Then for the last category, we have writing.
I feel like I got to ding them a little bit.
Yeah.
A little bit on the writing.
Yeah.
I do feel like the movie was a little, like 30 minutes too long, maybe.
No, and then also the vocabulary.
Yeah, the vocabulary. was a little bit-
Antivirus.
Yeah.
I don't know. If they could look up the words
Inoculation chamber.
Chimera and Bellerophon,
Yeah.
you know, they couldn't have done that.
Yeah, they couldn't have got the lingo is a little off. Like you said, the
DNA recombination.
DNA recombination, the whole thing about the video, which I still can't get over, and then just the you know, the kind of the symptoms being different than what they were billing it to be, what they're supposed to be. Just the little things here and there that just didn't make a lot of sense. Also, and we didn't really talk about this much during the discussion, but I assume the intent here was this Russian researcher is trying to bring the virus and the cure to CDC to get American help, I suppose.
That's what I thought was supposedly happening. Yeah.
But if you already had the cure, why not just bring the cure and not inject yourself with the virus? Do you need the virus in order to...
I mean, no. I mean, like if they
Wouldn't you have
studied-
extracted it from the cure?
But he didn't need to inject himself. If he's carrying a vial with the cure, that vial's not going to look any different other than the fact that one's red, one's green.
Yeah.
If you can bring the cure over, you should be able to just...
Technically, if he got caught and they found the cure, all he has is a vaccine or an antivirus or antiviral on him
Yeah.
versus something in him.
It also almost felt like an insurance policy that if he was intercepted, that they couldn't kill him immediately. They would have to secure him, take him somewhere, and then extract the virus, I suppose. But there was just little things like that where I had some questions about whether or not this is actually how it would go down if someone were to attempt to do these things. And for those reasons, I would lean towards like a 3 for the writing.
I would lean toward that too. I was also a little disappointed. I don't feel like we got enough information about transmission.
Yeah.
We had no idea how transmissible
That's
this
a
was.
great point. Or when transmission begins.
Or how it happens. Is it airborne? Is it respiratory?
But yeah, you know, very specific information about 20 hours and
So and there's the implication that at some point in the incubation period, you are going to be contagious because they left her in downtown Sydney.
Yeah, they did drop her.
As many her spreading it better. So presumably it would be respiratory in nature, but there's no discussion of at what point post 20 hours is that happening. You know,
Right.
So there's leaving stuff out like that. I think it's a 3.
Yeah, I agree.
yeah.
So with that, our final score is 3.72, which not bad.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Rob, for joining us again. Always a pleasure. Happy to have you.
And remember, this isn't mission difficult, it's mission impossible.
Well, that should be a walk in the park for you, Asha. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time.